Beach FM, locals talking to locals.
Beach FM, we have an important decision to make coming up. In September, I believe, we have an election. You may have heard about that, but there are two referenda that I think exercising a lot of people's thoughts, and we're going to be gathering various views over the next few weeks here on Beach FM. And the first comes today from Anne David. And a very good morning to you. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, John. Thanks for having me on.
Lovely to talk to you. You have a particular interest in the End of Life Act of last year, which we're being asked to make a decision on. Where does this interest come from?
I think probably from the same place as the interest of most supporters of the End of Life Choice Act, John. We are all people who have experienced suffering horrible deaths in our own families or families very close to us. And we realise that we don't do death and dying at all well in New Zealand, and there needs to be a legal provision for people who are at the limits of their tolerance of suffering, when nothing else can be done to relieve them, to legally opt out.
And I believe you have been talking to groups for a number of years on this subject.
Yes, I have. I talked to a number of groups, well, ever since the legislation was drawn from the ballot, really, and from the first reading, which was more than 2 years ago in Parliament. I've been talking to groups here locally and sometimes in Wellington. I also attend a number of market stalls in and around the Kapiti Coast, because I'm a resident in Waikanae. And we have a banner and our T-shirts that say, vote yes to the End of Life Choice. And people come over to us. And a lot of the people who come over to us are people who, like us, have seen suffering deaths, and also nurses, carers, palliative care nurses, palliative care carers, who confirm what we already know, that sometimes dying is acutely suffering for the person concerned, and of course for the family who's got to watch them through that suffering.
Some of the people who approach you, people of faith, who say this is simply against God's will.
Yes, occasionally yes, and that has to be respected. This is really a conscience decision for each individual, but we also need to know that there are plenty of people of faith who are planning to vote yes, irrespective of what their religious leaders tell them, because they have observed the cruelty and the unconscionable lack of compassion that we currently inflict on some of our dying. So not all people of faith are planning to vote no.
I wonder if we can go through some of the questions which occur to me. One of the issues that I have is the family who might be getting a little bit anxious seeing the inheritance seeping away, particularly in high-cost medical and possibly palliative situations, and the possibility that the family could coerce the older person, usually older person, but not always, of course, the person entering the last stages of life, coercing them to, in fact, to go early to save some money. I don't want to be too crass about it, but I think that could well be an issue that people are very worried about.
I agree with you, actually, John. Coercion is a real problem, not just for us in New Zealand, but everywhere in the world. And everywhere in the world, doctors are on the lookout for it. If you speak with any intensive care specialist, they will tell you about coercion. But doctors currently pick it up. It's not difficult to pick up. Any doctor with a bit of experience will tell you that contrary to what is stated, it's impossible to pick up. It is not impossible. It is very possible to pick up. And in that case, the doctor has to disregard the coerced request. And I would say that families sometimes coerce their loved ones into and out of medical decisions. It's not just one-way coercion. For example, there is a legal ability right now for a patient to request switch off of life support, which will end their life very shortly, depending on what kind of life support it is. Or a patient can reject proposed life-saving treatment. Nobody is obliged to accept recommended treatment. And by rejecting treatment, we can hasten our own deaths. Coercion is a possibility in all of those scenarios, but if we believe that doctors are unable to detect it, then we would have to say that informed consent does not exist in our medical system at all, because willingness or lack of coercion is one of the pillars of informed consent. And of course, informed consent does exist in our medical system, which shows us that doctors detect coercion and act against it very readily. And if they can do it in other situations, they can certainly do it for assisted dying. I'd also like to point out that in most medical cases, there is not a requirement for a two-doctor safeguard process, as there would be with assisted dying. So you are doubling the safeguards, and if we believe that coercion is picked up at the moment, then with double the safeguards, it's impossible to state that it is more dangerous. It will be safer and may, in fact, reveal some types of coercion.
Because we're asking a lot of doctors in this, aren't we? But moving on to another of the questions that have occurred to me, there's this thing called the enduring power of attorney. And this is a declaration that you make while you still have all your faculties to activate a request of how you want things to be treated if you're no longer capable of sort of actively ordering or participating in discussions about how things are going. Is it possible to have a request in that power of attorney for assisted dying if, in fact, you're not capable of entering that discussion?
No. The Act specifically rules that out. So an enduring power of attorney has no power with regards to the End of Life Choice Act. The request must come directly from a mentally competent patient who shows that they are uncoerced and who exhibits all of the eligibility criteria simultaneously. So no, the enduring power of attorney is worthless for this situation, but of course we should still have an enduring power of attorney for other circumstances.
What about the living will, which I think is slightly different? Can you ask for assisted dying in a living will?
No, not according to our Act. Our Act specifically rules out also the Advanced Health Directive, or living will, as you call it correctly. It cannot be used. Once again, the patient themselves has to be conscious and mentally competent right up to the last minute. And that means that, a living will is only used when the patient is unconscious and not able to speak for themselves. So there are some jurisdictions in the world that do accept a living will. Holland and Belgium accept the living will as a trigger for an assisted death, but not in New Zealand, and also not in Canada, not in most other places in the world. So no, it's useless. Doesn't mean to say we shouldn't have a living will. We should have an enduring power of attorney, and we should have a living will, but neither of them will be effective in the case of assisted dying.
Now, what about dementia patients? This is the one that really worries me. They obviously, well, there could be on occasions, competent and able to enter some kind of discussion, but there's no way that you could assume confidently that they're taking an informed part in that discussion. What about dementia patients? How on earth are they catered for in the Act of 2019?
Well, I believe that this is an act that will relieve a lot of suffering, but unfortunately it is not going to be able to relieve the suffering of dementia patients because they are excluded the minute they lose mental competence to decide. Now, if in an early stage of dementia, a dementia patient exhibits all the other criteria that are required, that is, that they have a terminal illness that is not dementia, another, say cancer, and they're likely to die in 6 months or less, and they are already in an advanced state of irreversible decline in physical capability at the time of making the request, and at the time of making the request, they are also experiencing unbearable suffering that cannot be relieved, then they could make a request provided they exercise the option before they lose mental competence. Once that's lost, they are no longer eligible.
Goodness me. Now, I've been in hospices. I've seen palliative care in action. I think that we have outstanding palliative care in this country. And I just admire the people who work there. Many of those people, if you talk to them, they are not at all enthusiastic about the end-of-life bill at all, or the Act as it is now. Why do you seem to be implying that palliative care is not enough to ensure that we don't suffer as we enter the last stages of life?
Well, it's not just myself who's implying it. Research shows that it is not always enough, and I agree with you. Palliative care is fantastic. Our standard of care is very high. Palliative care needs more funding. It needs to become more extensive. And interestingly, in jurisdictions that have passed assisted dying legislation, palliative care always benefits from a boost in funding and greater use. But statistics and data shows that somewhere between 5, 6, maybe even higher % of palliative care patients suffer severely, including in their terminal phase. And I get those data not from Palliative Care New Zealand, that doesn't examine itself, but from Palliative Care Australia, that on a 6-monthly basis sends reports on itself, and they are clinician reports, to the University of Wollongong in New South Wales for the data to be crunched. And they put out patient outcomes reports on a 6-monthly basis. And these are the findings. So this legislation would be for that rare category of person for whom even the best of care is insufficient.
And this has been very valuable. I'd like to thank you very much for this. Could I just finally ask you if you are happy with the information the government's put out on the website to inform the choice that people have to make in the forthcoming referendum?
Yes, I am, John, and I would like to put in a plug for the government here. It's the information is available on a website, referendums.govt.nz, and if you click on that website, you will see a summary of the Act, and then if you navigate down to the bottom of the page, you can click on a link that will take you to the direct words of the Act. And you can compare the summary with the direct words, and you will see that nothing has been added, nothing has been omitted. The language is perfectly neutral. We need to remember this is not a government piece of legislation. It was a private member's bill.
Yes.
So the government has no vested interest one way or the other in how we vote. But they do have an obligation to public education, and I think they've done that very well.
And it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us here on Beach FM. And David.
Thank you, John.
106.3 Beach FM.